Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. We're so glad that you're joining us today for Refugees International's year-end webinar. My name is Jeremy Kneindyke. I'm the president of RI. So, welcome to all of you. You're going to be hearing from some of our advocates today about the excellent work we've done amidst a really challenging environment over the past year and some of what we're thinking about for the year ahead. So we will be walking through some presentations and discussions with a number of Refugees International advocates, and then we have preserved some time towards the end for questions from all of you. Uh, as you all know, I'm sure if you're tuning into this webinar, it has been a pretty challenging year for refugees and for refugee advocacy. But what you may not always see is it's also been a really, in some ways, inspiring and motivating year for our work here at RI. Of course, we started the year off facing a refugee ban, a renewed refugee ban, and attacks on humanitarian aid from the Trump administration. We're closing the year as federal troops and immigration enforcement are marauding across multiple American cities and in many of our neighborhoods. So we're all familiar with the challenges. But what Refugees International is also finding this year are really important opportunities for impact and for progress, even in this challenging environment. So where we need to play defense on our issues and on our mission, we're playing defense. And we are continuing to find, as we always have, that average Americans continue to support refugees quite strongly, despite what they may be hearing from their government. There was a really impressive piece in the Washington Post that I point everyone towards a few days ago, talking about a woman in Chicago who, while she was a Trump voter and a very conservative person, was also working in her community to help Venezuelan refugees and to help protect them there. So, we're continuing to see a lot of support in the U.S. from average Americans for our issues and for refugees, and that comes through also in some of the polling that we've done, where this year we found some of the highest support for refugees and refugee resettlement that we've ever done in the years that we've been polling that issue. We're also seeing exciting new opportunities for impact overseas, particularly through our expanding partnerships with refugee leaders and refugee-led organizations around the world. And you'll hear more about that from some of our colleagues in a few minutes. So we're going to organize today's briefing around the three major pillars that have driven our advocacy in 2025: defending humane refuge, crisis advocacy, and shifting power. On defending humane refuge, we're going to hear about both some of the defensive work that Refugees International has done here in the United States to protect refugees and forcibly displaced people, many of whom are facing expulsion from the country. On the other side of the coin, we're going to hear about some of the exciting work that RI has been doing with partners in Kenya to expand refugee rights under that country's new refugee law. We'll then pivot to crisis advocacy, and we will spotlight some of Refugees International's work over the past year on the crises in Sudan and Gaza. And then finally, we will turn to our shifting power agenda. You'll hear about the work we are doing to lift up and promote refugee leadership in humanitarian action. Uh, Hear about some of the ways that we are applying that in a very tangible, hands-on way in Uganda. And you'll have the opportunity to hear directly from one of our refugee fellows about the work that she has done in post-war Syria. So we're really excited to share this with you today. It's been a tough year in a lot of ways, but it's also important, I think, to retain motivation, to retain hope. And we are certainly seeing in the work that we're doing that, notwithstanding the difficult environment, sometimes demotivating, definitely sometimes depressing, we also are seeing a lot of reasons for hope and inspiration. And sometimes in the worst moments, you see the best in people. And I think that's what we've been finding in our work and our partnerships over the past year. So we're really excited to share this with all of you. It is, of course, our end of year fundraising season. So if you feel motivated to give by what you hear from us here today, you can go to our website, refugiesinternational.org. There's a donate button on the front page, and we would be super grateful for your support. Of course, we take no funding from the government. We take no funding from the UN. So we are truly independent, and that means we are very reliant on the support of people like you. So we are so grateful for that. Um, Without further ado, let me hand over to my colleague Mohammed Naeem, who will lead us through the discussion today. Mohammed, over to you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for those opening remarks, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I will be very short here. These are difficult times. I think that is an obvious fact. But it is also a remarkable moment for our organization, for the community in which we advocate across, and the many of you who continue to support RI and the many groups and impacted community members all across this country and really all over the world. And so without further ado, I'd love to include my colleagues. Let's start the conversation. I will be moderating today's discussion. So we will begin with Defend Refuge. So would love to invite my colleagues, Dr. Yael Shaker and my colleague Abdullahi Alahi. Welcome, Yael and Abdullahi. So we will begin, Yael, with you. Um, Dr. Yael Shaker is Refugees International's director for the Americas and Europe. She also serves as our in-house expert on all things immigration and refugee policy, including the U.S. asylum system. And Abdullahi is our senior advocate for East and Southern Africa, has been an African policy expert with over a decade of experience in security, conflict, human rights, and strategic communication. So Yael, two-part question for you. The first is, how would you describe the current state of the U.S. refugee and asylum systems, and what broader trends are we seeing globally? And relatedly, just this last week, alongside our colleagues at Human Rights First, we've launched Banished by Bargain, a microsite that reveals the scope of U.S. transfer agreements, secretive transfer agreements with foreign governments. How do these factor into or affect immigrants and asylum seekers in the U.S.? And what should policymakers understand about its grave implications? So, Yael, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me, and thank you all for being here. Since President Trump has taken office, the administration has taken a few steps to sort of end refuge in the United States. First, suspended U.S. refugee admissions program and ended access to asylum at the U.S. border. This stranded vetted refugees overseas and led to the expulsion of asylum seekers to third countries. It was then supplemented by a travel ban on several countries like Afghanistan, Haiti, Venezuela, so people have no pathways to come to the United States. In the spring and summer, the Trump administration ended humanitarian parole and temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of people legally in the United States, depriving them of their ability to support themselves and putting them at risk of detention and deportation to danger in their home countries. Before the recent tragic shooting in DC, the Trump administration also announced a policy of re-vetting and re-interviewing all the refugees who had been resettled during the Biden administration, and then used the tragic shooting as an excuse to sort of end adjudication of all asylum applications and immigration applications of people from over a dozen countries that had nothing to do with that. We at RI have been pushing back against these policies by supporting litigation in the US courts, informing the public about how to themselves push back, and providing resources to the many people affected by the policies, especially through our Let Them Stay campaign that's really focused on those humanitarian parolees who have lost their status. We are also working with our Refugee Advocacy Lab, with state and local communities. The Let Them Stay campaign brings together partner organizations for monthly calls, has newsletters, takes actions. We are also working with these partner organizations and the populations they serve, and with state and local leaders to speak about the contributions of the immigrant populations and humanitarian parole populations to U.S. communities. Last month, I visited Chicago to work with the mayor's office there on supporting their immigrant and refugee communities at this time of, when there was this essentially roundup of people by the enforcement apparatus here And I'm currently working with a Venezuelan American organization in Chicago to make a video about a program, a music program in the Chicago public schools that teaches children how to play the cuatro, a traditional Venezuelan instrument. This is about putting a human face on a community that has been unfairly demonized and really should just have the opportunity to stay in the United States and continue contributing to their new communities here in the US. Unfortunately, the closing off of asylum and protection pathways and refugee resettlement is happening in Europe as well, which is limiting access to asylum, increasing detentions, deportations, and removals to third countries, and limiting resettlement. And what's happening in the US and in Europe is also spilling over into countries of the world hosting the vast majority of displaced people, much more per capita than the US. For example, places like Uganda, which was already mentioned, which just announced that unfortunately it will no longer be adjudicating the refugee claims of Somalis, Eritreans, and Ethiopians. Uganda is one of the countries with which the US signed an asylum cooperative agreement that we discussed in the tracker that Mohammed mentioned. The agreement allows the United States to refuse to consider asylum claims and instead send those asylum seekers to Uganda to seek asylum there. And this is happening at a time when the U.S. has cut aid to Uganda, and that's the reason it is rolling back its own refugee program. So we see how U.S. policy is also influencing policy elsewhere. This and the Uganda agreement and many of the agreements we track on our tracker are the opposite of countries working together to solve displacement crises and provide protection for refugees. The U.S. is paying autocratic governments like Eswatini and El Salvador to arbitrarily detain immigrants. Other governments like Ghana and Costa Rica have agreed to accept transfers of immigrants from the United States and refugees from the United States, and in doing so are violating their own human rights obligations by mistreating and repatriating the people that are transferred by the United States. What we are trying to do with our tracker is to document the punitive nature of this treatment of immigrants and asylum seekers by the United States and work with civil society partners in other countries to push back against these agreements and transfers. The idea is we don't want this to become the new institutional normal, undermining the cooperation built since World War II to find solutions to forced displacement crises and uphold the rights and meet the needs of refugees.
Thank you, Yael. That was really, really comprehensive. I mean, between enforcement, between deportations, and certainly these agreements, the system at large is in a precarious moment. So, Abdullahi, let's move over to you, especially where Yael left off there, and sort of surfacing Uganda and their recent sort of decisions around asylum. Um, the number of IDPs and refugees across Africa is at historic levels, from Sudan to Ethiopia to the Horn. Yet, U.S. humanitarian assistance, to Jeremy's earlier point, and other Western assistance writ large from Europe and otherwise has been scaled back. Just given this mismatch, what actions are needed from actors to avert what potentially can be an even larger and just more regionally consequential crisis? And what gives you some hope? What are some examples of hope within that context as well?
No, thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you everyone for joining in. I think just for the perspective, let's offer the number of people who are displaced in this part of the world. Number one, if you look at Uganda, Uganda hosts 2 million refugees, the vast majority of them from South Sudan. Kenya has almost a million, that is 850,000 refugees. Ethiopia hosts another 1 million. For many of these countries, what we have to bear in mind is that they are also generating refugees, they are hosting refugees, and refugees also pass through them. Just to drive home how difficult the aid cut that, like you mentioned, Muhammad, not just the United States, which takes the largest lion's share. EU, UK, Canada, Sweden, all of them have cut aid. This morning, as I was preparing for this, I had a conversation with a refugee leader in one of the leading refugee camps in Kenya, and he said to me, Abdullahi, there is a camp in Kenya that people have not received their food aid for the last 10 days. You can imagine you cannot you cannot move away from your camp and you do not have the food aid. And that just makes it very, very, very difficult for many of these refugees. However, despite the aid cuts that we see, some of these countries, including Kenya and Somalia and Ethiopia, are doing some, things that are at the moment look really promising if the funding would have been sustained, but because of lack of funding, they are not able to do some of them. Give an example. In the Somali region of the Ethiopia, what you are seeing is de facto integration of the refugees into the regional development plans. Because the way refugee situation resolves itself, primarily one through the refugees returning to their home countries once that country has become peaceful, and the other one is third country resettlement. So the damage that aid has done is it has not only denied these countries the money with which to support the refugees, it has also, most of these Western countries have also hardened their borders. That makes it very difficult. In fact, what they are doing externalization of some of these problems to countries like Uganda. So there is hope to the extent that in places like Kenya, in places like Ethiopia, Somalia region, these countries, despite having poor economic record and for foreseeable future, not having a ton of wiggle room to really support, forget about the refugees, their citizens, they are saying, despite aid cuts, we are going to support the refugees that we have with us. And to me, that really is one of the areas that really gives me a lot of hope. And if they are supported, some of these countries to continue supporting the refugees. Finally, I think the most critical thing is here what Uganda is doing. One would hope that there is no domino effect, that a country that has been this extremely generous, other countries hopefully will not learn their bad steps that they have taken in denying refugees refuge from Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea because they say there is not enough money to support them.
Thank you so much, Abdullahi, for just that sobering reminder at the back end. Thank you both, Yael and Abdullahi, for just the work you do and the work you'll continue to do into 2026. So we're going to transition now to the next part of our webinar, crisis advocacy. Jeremy had mentioned at the very top that there's been two sort of crises that we've invested an extraordinary amount of our advocacy around. One is on what is going on in Sudan, and the horrific images that are coming from al-Fashir and just other parts of the country, and certainly on Gaza. So would like to invite my colleagues Dan and Natasha to join me. Welcome, Dan, and welcome, Natasha. So Dan Sullivan is our Director for Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and has well over 20 years of experience working on human rights and foreign policy issues between several leading organizations. And Natasha Hall is our new senior advocate for the Middle East, having just joined us just a few months ago, and has well over 2 decades of experience as well across humanitarian crises, conflict zones, particularly in the region and across the Middle East. So Dan, we'll start off with you. The reports from al-Fashir have shocked the world and continues to shock the world. But you've been documenting the human cost of Sudan's civil war for years. What are civilians facing at this stage of the conflict? And what are some concrete measures that the U.S. and other ally nations can do to support and protect lives and ensure that humanitarian aid can reach the very communities that need it?
Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, start off by saying that Refugees International has engaged on Sudan for a long time, and personally, I started my career with Save Darfur, and especially over the last couple of years, myself and my colleagues have traveled to various parts of Sudan and surrounding countries who are hosting refugees, and hearing directly from them what their experiences are, and as you mentioned, with the fall of El Fasher in recent years, we're seeing what was being reported as the largest atrocity event so far, and that's saying a lot for a lot of atrocity events that have happened. But we continue to see this pattern of aid being blocked, which is leading to food insecurity, even to the level of famine in some country or some parts of the country. and atrocities that both by the two main sides, the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, and in the case of the RSF, amounting to genocide again. So we're seeing that since the fall of al-Fashir, things are shifting to the Kordofans as an area where we're seeing a lot of atrocities. And people may have seen in the news recently, a few days ago, that RSF drones targeted a kindergarten and a hospital. So we continue to see this. We have a refugee fellow who's from Sudan, part of their one of the local emergency response rooms that have been a really bright spot in this. And she tells us regularly, almost daily, in touch with colleagues who are needing to evacuate people or to set up community kitchens, but they're doing some really important work. Which gets me to so what can we do about it? What can the international community do about it? And first and foremost is supporting those local groups, supporting the emergency response rooms and other local Sudanese groups. And there's different ways to do that. We at Refugees International recently did a report and have dived into some of the more technical ways that through the UN mechanisms of funding, we can increase the localized funds that are going directly to those local groups. And then more generally, just lifting up those actors. On the other side, there's, globally, key actors, the United States and other countries have a key role to play. We saw for the first time a couple of weeks ago that where President Trump actually acknowledged and addressed the crisis in Sudan. This was part of a visit by Saudi Arabia, and we have the so-called Quad of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the U.S. That have put out statements that talk about all the things that need to happen, including open humanitarian access, support for civilians, a pause to the fighting. The problem is that these external actors are not acting in good faith, and among those who really stands out is the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, in their direct support of weapons, well documented to the RSF, which are committing genocide. So we have worked with congressional actors and are supporting a call for an end to the U.S. supplying arms to the UAE, so that the UAE is not able to support those who are committing genocide. And beyond that, it requires such a massive effort. We're looking at creative ways. Who else can we approach? And one thing we're doing with the broad coalition of groups is looking at those brands that are lifting up the image of the UAE and helping to sort of wash over their reputation. And first and foremost, right now is the NBA, which is hosting right now their marquee in-season tournament, which is named the Emirates NBA Cup. So we're trying to raise awareness about that. The fact that the NBA is partnering with a group that is directly sponsoring genocide is something that NBA fans should be worried about, something we all should be worried about. And so that's one concrete action everyone here can take is if you go to the speakoutонsudan.org website, which I believe is in the chat now. We have an active petition and, as I said, working with a broad coalition of groups to try to do whatever we can to bring that to bear and again, go back to the need to support those local groups in Sudan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. From one crisis to another, Gaza has been sharply not just on our minds but on our screens for the better part of the last couple of years. Natasha, I know you've done quite a lot of work, both before our eye and certainly now, on this issue. So the Gaza peace deal may have lowered the intensity of the conflict, but it has not alleviated the profound humanitarian crisis. Can you outline for our viewers the current realities facing civilians and maybe unpack some of the major gaps that continues to exist across the international community's response that is fueling the realities on the ground for the millions of Palestinians?
Yeah, Mohammed, thank you for the question, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon as well. I mean, one of the reasons I'll just step back a little bit that Refugees International focuses so much on this is because Gaza is really ultimately one of the big major chinks in America's credibility globally, being involved so deeply in this conflict that has really devastated Palestinian lives and continues to do so. So to answer your question, I mean, really what I'm hearing from people on the ground is there is no ceasefire. Almost 400 people have been killed since the ceasefire began. And we're seeing major obstructions in aid to this day. And, you know, so let me just start with the facts on aid alone. In terms of the carefully tracked UN coordinated aid, we're talking about 100 to 200 trucks a day. This is a really long shot from the 600 trucks a day that we saw from a temporary ceasefire earlier this year. And this time, the ceasefire we would hope was meant to be somehow sustainable, but I think with this amount of aid, it might not be. Now, if you hear numbers like 600 to 800 trucks a day, what this is really doing has been conflating commercial trucks that have, you know, cigarettes and candy with the UN coordinated aid that's going in. But the reality is that nearly $50 million worth of humanitarian aid is currently stuck outside of Gaza. Since the ceasefire agreement, at least 124 international NGO cargo requests have been rejected. Most NGOs and UN agencies report security risks from nearby strikes, unexploded ordnance, and are experiencing widespread supply chain failures. Almost 80% reported major disruptions tied directly to Israel's rejected entry requests. And so all of this is happening as winter sets in. Some of you may have seen the pictures, the videos of heavy rains in November already flooding displacement sites. This is really mixing sewage with rain where people currently live. Nearly 1.5 million people need emergency shelter right now. But we're seeing numbers like hundreds of emergency shelter kits going in rather than thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Much of these bits of equipment have been rejected by Israel through a so-called dual use list, which includes things like bandages and band-aids and even blankets. So we know that, you know, this is just simply not sustainable. Meanwhile, another crisis is setting in. Israel has set new registration rules for international NGOs, and this has created another barrier. And there's many other barriers that we have been talking about, trying to provide a more nuanced view as to what's going on. And in terms of sort of the monopolization of aid that's going through, and then commercial supplies, which are simply not meeting the need. And so I think that, you know, in a nutshell, this is why organizations like Refugees International matter, because when the media attention fades from many of these crises, we're staying focused on the people still living in the crisis. And that's why we're working on messaging on the Gaza crisis. We're going to go to the region to provide more ground truth. We're currently working with Congress on relevant legislation because we really want to get beyond sort of the truck counts and the headlines to really amplify the voices that are increasingly silenced by surveillance, restrictions on international journalists, and even the targeting of local journalists and aid workers. You know, and I'll just leave you with this. I think a lot of you know probably Hind Rajab, who was the little girl who was trapped inside of a car with her deceased relatives having been killed by Israel. We know her because her voice was on desperate calls to the Palestinian Red Crescent for getting rescued over the course of hours before she herself was killed, along with those rescue workers. The reason we know her is because we have that voice. And so what we're really working to do is to really amplify the voices of more people like Hind Rajab, because the reality is in Gaza, in Syria, in many other parts of the world, there are hundreds, thousands of Hinds out there. And so that's what we aim to do.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing and spotlighting back to what is most fundamental across these crises, that these are just not geopolitical tensions between nation states, but that it involves and implicates directly the people who are suffering, both across Sudan, across Gaza, and really across other parts of the world. So thank you both, Dan. Thank you, Natasha. That is a really wonderful segue in terms of spotlighting the stories, the perspectives, the realities of those who are living it. And so would love to move to our power shifting portion of the agenda. So would love to invite my colleagues, Dr. Huria Tafek, my colleagues Jocelyn Perry, and one of our newest refugee fellows, Kenda Hawesley. Welcome, Huria, welcome Jocelyn, and welcome Kenda. So excited to have you. Dr. Huria Tafek is our Director for Refugee Leadership and Partnerships, where she leads some of our groundbreaking work to ensure that the perspectives and the experiences of refugees are factored into policymaking at all levels. Jocelyn Perry is our Senior Advocate for the Climate Displacement Program, having well over 15 years of experience working between advocacy, research, policymaking, and direct service on climate change and with displaced populations. And so thrilled that Kenda Hawesley can join us, a fellow in our Refugees International's Refugee Fellows Program, is a social unit manager at the Syrian Dialogue Center. She's calling in from Turkey at the moment. The Syrian Dialogue Center is a leading political and social think tank based in Turkey, and she is also the co-founder of the Al Salam Institute for Women's Studies, the very first Syrian think tank established and led by female experts. We will start with you, Huria. In your most recent report just a few months ago on the state of refugee leadership, you outlined what it takes to meaningfully elevate refugee perspectives in policymaking spaces. Drawing on some of your own experience co-founding our space and leading our refugee leadership program, what are some key lessons that other groups can keep in mind as they seek to strengthen their own efforts within their own institutions? Huria, over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you for everyone who has joined us today. So at Refugees International, we have started our Refugee Fellows program almost 2 years ago in 2023. And the aim behind this program was to make sure that the refugee leaders who are on the ground advocating for their communities are actually equipped, have access to policymaking venues, and well-resourced. And every year we receive over 1,000 applications for our program, and we're trying our best to learn how to actually work with the leaders on the ground, because they are the one who are actually closer to the crisis, and they are the one who would actually come with the best solutions. Also, over the last 2 years, we have been co-partnering with refugee-led organization to create a refugee-led forum. And this forum is called Our Space, and we are having a really big convening for Our Space next week that we invite anyone who is in Geneva to join us on the site of the Global Refugee Forum Progress Review. The main idea behind the Our Space was how we can create a forum where refugees lead the agenda and drive the solution themselves. And one common thing across our refugee-led initiatives or our refugee leadership portfolio is RI is a non-refugee-led organizations, which is being engaged in efforts that have to deal with refugee leadership. That puts us in a very sensitive spot that we have a lot to learn. We cannot say we have learned everything so far, but I can give 3 main tips on how we have been trying to learn out of our experience in actually being involved in the refugee leadership movement. The first thing we have learned is when you're trying to create a refugee leadership initiative within your organization, don't deal with it as a separate initiative at the corner of the organization where everything is happening. The organization is on another side. It has to be infused within what the organization is doing internally and externally. So how you set priorities in partnership with the refugee leaders, for example, with our fellows, they are working in partnership with the advocates to set the priorities for the portfolio for the year where the fellows are part of the organization, how you conduct your work in partnership on the ground with the refugee leaders or the impacted communities. So always think about it as it has to be infused. I'm not saying at RI we have perfecting that. We are trying, but we have learned. We can never say that we are doing refugee leadership right or power shifting right unless it is infused across all the organization. The second tip is to try and build the trust and accountability with the refugee-led community. Building trust and accountability take a lot of commitment and take a lot of work. So don't expect that refugee-led organization or refugee leaders gonna trust you. as an equal partner while you are non-refugee led, unless you really show that you are there to support and you are there to put the work in, and you're not just riding another wave of refugee leadership and you're trying to just look good. Right? You have to do good. And this is a very important thing when it comes to build the trust. Once you build the trust and accountability, you try to find your own role. Are you a facilitator? Are you a convener? But for sure, you cannot equate yourself as the refugee-led organization. And the third thing, and it is also important, whom you put in charge. I mean, I know I'm at RI, and I'm in charge of this, but if you can find an employee who has a refugee background or forcibly displaced background with the technical expertise, this combination, it's very important, not just technical expertise and not just forcibly displaced background. This combination, it will help a lot. And to be able to make sure that your portfolio is or your initiative is successful, because I can attest, no matter how much empathy a person could have to try and understand what others have been through, it's very important that you have been through that, and that will drive a lot of your work. It takes a lot of commitment to be at 2 a.m. up with other colleagues because someone is stuck at the airport because they don't have the right paper, or someone needs help. Some refugee-led organization who are in a very critical position, which like maybe 5 a.m. call. So all of that need a bit of commitment and need to have the right people in charge. And that's it from my side. And this is the 3 tips that I hope that it would help other organizations when they are thinking about infusing refugee leadership within their organization. Thank you.
All right. Well, that's an excellent landing point. Jocelyn, you've dealt with all of this on the backside. I know you traveled recently to Uganda earlier this year with some of our esteemed former fellows, and later represented RI at the Conference of the Parties, the UN Climate Summit, alongside 2 of our emeritus refugee fellows. You've really powerfully demonstrated what advancing refugee-centered leadership looks like. Could you speak to a little bit what you took away from those experiences and how they are informing your work and certainly RI's work around some of these issues?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mohammed and Horia. I am just so appreciative of the Refugee Fellows Program because it offers a really powerful avenue for all of our advocacy and advancing our policy work beyond just refugee spaces as well. Because in my portfolio, as you've mentioned, I work in both international multilateral spaces like the UN climate negotiations, the Conference of the Parties, or the COP, which was held in Brazil last month, as well as at national and local government levels on their policymaking around climate change. And I've had the opportunity to work with several refugee fellows. And this year at the UN climate negotiations, we were fortunate to have 2 of our emeritus fellows, Ayo Irene Helen and Kiamuddin Ikram, join us for their 2nd and 3rd COPs, respectively. And Ayo is a South Sudanese refugee living in Uganda and just an incredible advocate for solar cooking and solar energy within refugee settings, as well as adaptation strategies for refugee communities. And Kiamuddin is an Afghan refugee now living in Germany who is just a brilliant expert in GIS, geographic information systems, and environmental risk mapping, and has been doing work on supporting Afghan refugees adapting to flooding in Pakistan. So we've been really fortunate that Ayo and Kiam could join our delegations to COP because they're representing the interests of, a small portion of refugees from around the world, and they're bringing their expertise and the technical expertise that Horia was mentioning to the negotiations as well. I would estimate, I think, back of envelope calculations that there were fewer than a dozen refugees at COP this year. They don't keep official numbers on that, but there were close to 56,000 attendees and some, I think, 23,000, maybe 14,000 from NGOs. So I worked it out ahead of time. Maybe 0.1% of the total NGOs in attendance were refugees at all, and 0.02% of the total attendees of COP were refugees. And so having Ayo and Kiamuddin there was really critical to bringing their interests to the table. And especially in the current environment that we're in. Just hearing from my colleagues before, the geopolitics of support for refugees around the world is a real struggle at the moment. And we're seeing this show up in the climate negotiations as well, that countries, both from the global north and global south, are really pushing back against any support for refugees and mention of refugees and their needs in the climate negotiations. And we saw a lot of backsliding, or it took a lot of work to prevent backsliding even on the negotiations this year for refugee inclusion. But even though refugees were largely excluded from the negotiation rooms and were being cut out of texts, we were able to make sure that their voices were heard. And really excitingly, this year we had 9 events that Io, Kiam, and I spoke to, and one of them opened COP with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the Deputy Director General of the International Organization for Migration on a panel that Io was able to speak on as well to share her work and advocacy from Uganda. And for Mexican cinema fans, UNHCR's Goodwill Ambassador Alfonso Herrera was also on that panel and was so impressed by Io's remarks that he has promised to visit her in Uganda and to see the work that she's doing firsthand there. Uh, so going to our work in Uganda, I was able to highlight for this event that we have been working rather than going through the United States government directly, but going directly to the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda to help them develop their national adaptation plan. As the largest host government for refugees in Africa, Uganda has been a really critical pillar of refugee inclusion across Africa and really the world. And making sure that they include refugees in their climate planning means that refugees can then be included down the line in response measures to climate change. So, preventing droughts from affecting farming and refugee communities, adapting to extreme heat, dealing with flooding, etc. All of those need to be taken into account as we plan for this work in Uganda. So to achieve this, we hosted a capacity building session for 65 refugee leaders from across 12 of the refugee settlements in Uganda for 3 days in Kampala in September. And this allowed the refugee leaders to learn directly from the government about the national adaptation planning process, and also to showcase for the government how they're feeling the effects of climate change in their communities and what work they're already doing. And so this will allow them, and we're pushing for that work to be taken forward at the district level, so the local level in Uganda, to ensure continued engagement with these refugee communities rather than a one-off engagement. And this is really essential but intensive in-person advocacy work. And so I think that's why Refugees International support for this work is so critical, so that we're able to continue and sustain it. And then we're taking this pilot from Uganda forward to Ethiopia and to other countries as well. And this opportunity came about because Io was actually presenting about our work in Uganda at a meeting in Geneva last June. And someone from the Ethiopian government heard her and said, "We'd like to do that too. Could RI support us in this work?" And to me, this highlights the need for those connections and ensuring that refugees have access to these places and the happenstance opportunities that often arise in them, which is something that our space and the work that Horia is doing there is really critical in promoting. So we're continuing to take this forward by outreaching to refugee leaders in Ethiopia and then in other countries as well. Specifically, there are over a dozen countries who've made pledges at the Global Refugee Forum 2 years ago to include refugees in their climate work. And our hope is to provide those countries with both the encouragement and the tools to deliver on those pledges in the next 2 years ahead of the next Global Refugee Forum, and to support the refugee leaders to be part of these processes in a meaningful way. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jocelyn. That was really, really comprehensive and just a really wonderful example of what it means to centralize refugee leadership as part of our sort of policymaking advocacy. So we will land sort of today's webinar before Q&A. So if you have any questions, burning questions, please do submit them, and we'll get to them in just a little bit. Invite Kinda, welcome. Syria is navigating a political transition that has not been seen in many, many, many decades with the fall of the Assad regime, roughly about a year ago. The anniversary, I think, was earlier this week. How can refugee leaders like yourself, both inside the country, certainly, and really across the diaspora, play a central role in shaping what Syria becomes? And what are some of the barriers that need to be removed to enable their and your full participation? So, Kinda, over to you. Bring us home.
Thank you, Mohammed, for this invitation. When we speak or when we talk about Syria future during the political transition or reconstruction phase, we must remember that the refugee have a fundamental role in this situation. Syrian refugees are not a marginal figures in the Syrian land space, but rather than a political, social, and economic force that cannot be ignored. We are speaking about 6 million Syrian refugees who have developed their experience and skill in their host country and who also built a network and the capacity for international influence. And ignoring this way is not realistic or ethical option. So it is important to emphasize that refugees are not a bargaining ship or a political file for resolve the migration issues by the host country, and we must protect their right and protect their dignity. And also, ending the refugee crisis is not a technical process or a political deal, but a complex humanitarian and human rights progress. And refugee must participate in formulating, implementing, and also monitoring solution. And in our situation, especially the refugee in Turkey can become a true bridge between their home country and the host country, and also they are capable to of transferring their governance experience and create also channels of international pressure and making communication or connection with a local community with a political and economic resource. And at this pivotal moment in Syria, when we are building a new system or a new legitimacy, the refugee and IDP return can be a true indicator that of the return of stabilities. Their voluntary, safe, and organized return that will show that our country has entered a new phase and they are ready to contribute to their experience to reconstruction. But unsafe and planned return, which some countries are trying to push for, can renew the conflict and also create competition for resource and also create a new wave of displacement. So we have to recognize that some current obstacles we are facing now. As long as we refugee are seen as only a vulnerable individual required assistance rather than decision making, their rule will remain and marginalize only, and the discussion will remain only as a humanitarian discussion rather than political or institutional or right. In addition to that, now in Syria we are facing insecurity return environment, and with the social tension, the lack of the legal service, the absence of the basic need, and also the lack of job opportunities. All of these environment and with the absence of the international support, make it will made the will make the returning as a risk rather than a step toward stabilities. For this reason, we need support. We need a real partnership rule that bring together all stakeholders, especially refugee themselves, and shifting the power to design a sustainable returning plan that strengthen sustainabilities and prevent the country from sliding into a new cycle of violence. Finally, I think refugees are not a file to be closed, but a partner to be empowered and also opportunities to be seized. Without their participation, we cannot think about, or there can be no stable political transition or no meaningful reconstruction, and also no end for these tricky migration issues that worries the Western country.
Thank you so much for that, Kinda. And just a really great example of what it means for a crisis to be sort of back channeled and forgotten, and then all of a sudden things shift and things change, and the role of refugees become that much more clear in shaping the future of their country. So really excited for the work that you'll do ahead. So we would love to invite everybody to ask your questions if you haven't already done so. Eliza, can we bring everybody back to on camera? Thank you again for joining us. This is really just a snapshot of the work that we do across Refugees International. We focus on domestic policy with campaigns like Let Them Stay, the work that we're doing across Africa between Abdullahi and Sudan, the crisis spotlights on Gaza, for example, that Natasha's leading, and the communications work of our colleagues on my team, the strategic outreach team, as well as the powerful role of power shifting that Huria is leading and others are incorporating. Invite folks to ask your questions. As folks are sort of feeding that in, I have a question, I have a back pocket question rather, to Jeremy, actually. Jeremy, I'll bring you in here. Congress seems to be a little bit in, there's not a lot moving in Congress that can improve upon the conditions that our colleagues sort of spoke about. And so U.S. policy making aside, what is the role of advocates really across the world in helping to shape a much more responsive humanitarian system?
Yeah, at a time when the U.S. government is frequently an adversary on the things that we care about rather than a partner or even really an advocacy target. We're responding to that in a few ways, and I think we've covered some of that on this call. So in some respects, we're moving even closer to the front lines of refugee crises. So, working directly with refugee hosting governments in places like Kenya and Uganda, as you've heard about here, but also, we're doing versions of that in Costa Rica, in Mexico. As Jocelyn said, we're expanding that also to Ethiopia, and doing that in partnership with refugee leaders, as you just heard about so eloquently from Horia, Jocelyn, and Kenda. But we're also looking upstream, on issues like U.S. asylum policy and protection of refugees domestically, on issues like U.S. policy on Israel and Gaza. These are issues where we can't always immediately get to the current crop of policymakers in the U.S. government. But just as important as that is also convincing Americans. And so we are putting a lot of emphasis at the moment, not just in speaking truth to power, but also in speaking truth to people and speaking more directly to the American people, working on shifting narratives, shifting public understanding in ways that over time will filter back into political change. There's also one really cool thing. I want to put Huria on the spot here. One really cool thing that we did this year in the rubric of shifting power globally is put the candidates to be the next UNHCR High Commissioner on the spot in a public way. And so, Horia, why don't you say a couple words about that and why it was so historic?
Sure, thank you, Jeremy. Yes, so through our space that I have talked about before, the Refugee-led Forum, this year was so historic because for the first time ever, we managed to convene the candidates who are running for the UNHCR Higher Commissioner position, to convene them as a refugee-led forum for the first time in New York and Geneva, where they had to answer for the questions that have been selected by refugees themselves. We have sent out a survey for refugee worldwide about what kind of question would like to ask the candidates, and we had over 200 votes for the questions, and we were able to be in the same room as refugee leaders convening the candidates. And this is historic because it's the first time ever to happen, and it's the first time ever to happen by a refugee-led forum where we had to ask the candidates, what's your plan about power shifting internally at UNHCR and externally? And we had set the expectations that once you become a commissioner, you have to deal with the refugee-led agenda, and we are here to be dealt with as experts.
Yeah, Jeremy, you read my mind. I was actually going to go to Hudia myself as well. So that's just an excellent example of the kind of transformation that we've seen, really thanks in large part to the many philanthropies who've invested in that kind of work, and some of you who are on the call today, and the organizations who are actualizing it. Yael, final question to you for a minute or so. With the state reality being what it is here in the United States on domestic policy, what what's something that keeps you hopeful in 2026? I know it's tough sledding here. But with the Let Them Stay campaign, we've seen such a remarkable response from our colleagues across the country. So yeah, with 60 seconds, yeah, would love your thoughts.
I really think what we've seen in local communities across the country in terms of the rapid response to the enforcement has been really inspiring. I know right near where I live in DC, somebody was arrested on my block, and all of us responded by putting a sign on our street that said, "Community member was arrested by ICE here." There are signs like that all over the city to make sure that people are aware of it. And I don't think this enforcement that is happening is popular. What we're seeing is that it's increasingly obvious that um, the Trump administration's enforcement policy is out of sync with the public. And what I hope is that in the future, as we come up to the midterm elections, we'll get an opportunity to do what there has been a few forms of congressional engagement, but I think the shift in public sentiment and the response by community members to protect their neighbors and to fight for their neighbors will drive politicians to really, in the next Congress, take a different stance and push back against some of the policies that we're seeing.
All right. All right. Well, thank you for that. It's been a real honor to be able to moderate today's conversation. So, Jeremy, over to you to bring us home. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, and thanks to all of you for joining, and for staying with us throughout this. I hope this has given you a sense of the breadth of what we do in the course of a year at Refugees International, the sorts of impacts that we are able to achieve, the sort of progress that we're able to make, and a sense of hopefulness, which I know we all feel about the prospects to change some of the things that we're seeing in the world and here in the United States. And as Yael said, and I think it bears repeating, it can feel sometimes like it's just problem after problem after problem, and it is. And look, there's no shortage of challenges that we're seeing when it comes to how refugees and forcibly displaced people are being treated by the U.S. government right now. But it's not popular, and as people see in their communities what this means, it is not popular. The cities that are experiencing these crackdowns are overwhelmingly rejecting them, not cooperating with them. And I think for anyone who has seen this in their neighborhoods and in their communities, as you know, many of us have, it is not the kind of world and the kind of country and the kind of community that we want to live in. And so part of our job as we go forward as RI is to connect those sentiments to action and to policy. And I think there is some real hopefulness there, because ultimately politics are downstream of culture. And if the culture rejects the sorts of things that we're seeing, that will come through in the politics too. So, but it takes work, and we are doing that work. We're ready to keep doing that work. And we are really so excited to be working and supported by all of you in how we do that. I would also just really urge and encourage all of you to get involved. You can go to our website. We have an action page on our website, things you can do to support our work defending refugees here in the United States, pushing back on the UAE's sponsorship of violence and mass atrocities in Sudan, and other actions besides. So we need your support, we need your action, and we are so glad to have all of you as allies. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't point you one more time to our year-end fundraising campaign, which you can find on the front page of our website, refugiesinternational.org. And there's a donate button right there that you can use if you're moved to support us after hearing all of this today. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your passion and your interest in these issues. And we look forward to partnering with you as we head into 2026. Thank you, everyone.